This is GM Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Magnus Carlsen taking on Hikaru Nakamura in an Armageddon game at the 2023 Champions Chess Tour Finals.
Magnus, 15 minutes. I guess that means you win it.
Both sides, they're putting in their bids. Magnus Carlsen bid 15 minutes, which means he insists on having the white pieces, but Hikaru will have 9 minutes and 40 seconds to start the game, as well as draw odds. If the game ends in a draw, then Hikaru Nakamura takes the match, and they are off. Game is underway. It is Carlsen versus Nakamura, with Hikaru handling the black pieces. He has draw odds, so if this game ends in a draw, then Hikaru will have defeated Carlsen in their mini-match. And what a surprise early on in the game. Hikaru essaying a Petrov, that's not the surprise, but he takes on e4. Traditionally, this is not considered to be a good move because of queen e2, but Magnus immediately deviates from the known theory. Hikaru might have prepared a tricky line instead. Magnus chasing away Hikaru's knight and then pushing the pawn up to d4. Hikaru reciprocates with d5, and now the position is very symmetrical indeed. The only difference is that Magnus has ensconced that knight on e5. He might have a very small edge because of that, as the players continue to develop their pieces, making moves quickly. Both sides, castle to the king side. And now, presumably, Magnus is going to continue developing. Bishop to g5. Looks like a pretty good spot for White's dark squared bishop. The knight from b1, it can come out to c3, but often that's an inadvisable method of development because it actually blocks the c2 pawn, which can advance up to c4 and challenge Black's control of the center. Hikaru very surprised, it seems, at Carlsen's choice to develop the bishop to f4, where it ensures that the knight on e5 is going to be extra well protected. And maybe Hikaru can do what Magnus wants to do eventually and challenge White's control of the center with c5. That knight on e5 is going to be a major problem for Black. How is Hikaru going to work around that knight? A little bit of hesitation there. Hikaru playing a pretty standard move, rook e8, adding some pressure to that knight on e5. The battle is revolving around the center. Now it's Magnus's turn. Magnus Carlsen taking his time. He's almost done with his development. And that decision to develop his dark squared bishop to f4 rather than g5, let's see if that will end up helping him or hurting him. Carlsen fidgeting with the only pawn that he has captured thus far and copying Hikaru Nakamura. He brings his own rook, his own tower to the open file, and there it is. There is that c5 move. Hikaru adopting a very principled way of fighting White's control over the center, challenging the d4 pawn, and trying to undermine the support of the e5 knight. And there it is. He's finally made a move, and it is, in fact, knight c3, the spiciest of the candidate moves that we had outlined. He simply leaves the d4 pawn. He says, Hikaru, I don't care. You can take it. My knight is heading to b5. And after c takes d4, the knight will almost certainly jump to b5, hitting Black's bishop on d6. Is he going to take the plunge and grab Carlsen's pawn on d4, allow the knight from c3 to jump to b5, or is he going to go for a tamer option, maybe knight c6, maybe even a move like a6 in order to contain the mobility of the knight on c3? But of course, Hikaru hasn't completed his development either, and so he buys himself a tempo. He chooses the relatively quiet move c4, keeping the pawn structure intact in the center, and Magnus actually drops his bishop to e2. I was expecting bishop f1, and there we go. Both sides have now completed their development. Hikaru developed his knight to c6, and now the light squared bishop slides up to e6, adding an important defender to the d5 pawn. So the most tempting move for White here is bishop to g5, trying to eliminate the f6 knight and ultimately get to the d5 pawn. I don't think it would be a good idea for White to trade on c6. While that would ruin Black's pawn structure on the surface, the b7 pawn would slide up to c6, and the d5 pawn would be very safely protected. White's light squared bishop would not look good at all. Bishop back to e7. What an interesting move by Nakamura. The bishop retreats, adding another defender to the d5 pawn. Now Black's queen is participating in the defensive task. I think Hikaru is trying to take the sting out of a potential bishop sally to g5. Magnus might have to find another area of the board to play on. The d5 pawn is now protected by 3 separate pieces. How is Magnus going to prosecute his initiative? And b3 is his choice. He's going at it from the other side. Rather than attacking the base of the pawn chain, he's going after the tip of the pawn chain, engineering a trade of pawns on the queen side. How is he going to recapture? Well, our mamas taught us that the best way is to recapture toward the center. A takes b3 would open up that rook on a1. It would allow White to exert a little bit of pressure on the a7 pawn. Obviously, Hikaru's position is ultra solid at the time, but Magnus has that space advantage. He still has his knight nicely sitting on e5, and if Hikaru is the one to take on e5, Magnus might be able to recapture with the pawn, and then the d5 pawn is likely to fall. And so Hikaru is working around that knight instead. Bishop to b4 is an excellent move. There it is, knight to d3, not a happy camper as Carlsen is forced to voluntarily drop his knight back from e5 and chase that bishop away from b4. Now notice, knight takes d4 is not possible here because the bishop on b4 will hang, and the bishop on f3 is protected by the g2 pawn. And he takes on c3. Why did he do that? Look at how Hikaru is handling this middle game. He is just trying to get as many pieces off the board as possible, and his follow-up move, bishop to g4, forces the light-squared bishops off the board. Magnus will now have no choice but to acquiesce to the trade of bishops. First, he grabs the rook. Lots more pieces are coming off the board, a pair of rooks, now the bishops, and now white no longer has the bishop pair, and Hikaru has that e4 square that he could try to sink his teeth into when the knight moves back from g4 to f6. But the downside of Hikaru's campaign to trade all of the pieces is that he's given away control of the e-file. The e-file is the most important avenue in this board, and now white has firm control of that file. Magnus kind of raising his eyebrows, almost indicating that he just doesn't see anything that appeals to him, but he has to find a way to keep the games going. Finally, Carlsen deciding on h3, chasing the knight away, and knight to b4. What an interesting decision by Carlsen, and Hikaru was either very happy to see that or very surprised to see that. Magnus offering a trade of knights, and maybe Hikaru is surprised that Carlsen is voluntarily trading off the horses, but clearly there's a lot more to this move than might meet the eye. So knight takes b4 would lead to a trade of knights, and white's queen would jump into b4. Black could then take the pawn on c2, but white would reciprocate by capturing on b7. Hikaru could also stick his knight on e4, and now it's Hikaru's turn to calculate the variations. So the options are knight e4, which is likely, and it's been played. Knight to e4 is on the board, and indeed, knight takes c6, and look at Hikaru. He takes not white's queen, but instead white's knight, and another pair of minor pieces has now come off the board. We have a bishop versus knight imbalance. Hikaru has entrenched a knight on e4, but that's not an outpost. White could chase that knight away in the future with the move f3. He can bring it up to a5, and he does. Queen to a5, attacking the pawn on a7, keeping black's rook at bay. And there's a sense in which Hikaru is under a little bit of pressure here. He's got a lot of weaknesses on the queen side. His pawn on d5 is no longer isolated, but instead its neighbor on c6. That's a long-term weakness. The pawn on a7 is isolated, and it's being pressured by white's queen. That's a long-term weakness. White's bishop on f4 has access to a lot of good dark squares. On black's side of the board, the e5 square could be used as a base of operations. Hikaru has to tread carefully here as he pushes h5, grabbing space on the king side and making a space for his king on h7. Now, he will not have to deal with the weakness of his back rank. And there we go. Magnus chases the knight back to f6. Now the knight on f6 is completely restricted by the pawn on f3 and its neighbor on h3. Magnus will have to make a decision momentarily. Time continues to tick down. So what are the options here for Carlsen? He could try to get the queens off the board, but that doesn't seem like a very good idea because his king seems to be a little bit safer than black's. Even though he's got more pawns pushed in front of his king, the bishop is generally better in these open board situations. There's no question that white is in the driver's seat, but there aren't a lot of pieces left, and Carlsen has to continue making more problems for black. Rook to e5. What a decision. Rather than putting the bishop on e5, he puts his tower on e5, and he challenges the h5 pawn, and Hikaru doesn't seem too happy to see that. And queen to d7, moving the queen up and protecting a7 and preparing to swap rooks with rook e8. And with every piece that comes off the board, black's defensive task becomes easier and easier, and the significance of black's weakened king continues to diminish. Hikaru adopts a more relaxed posture. Queen to d7 was a nice calm reaction, and Carlsen brings his own queen, brings that lady back from a5 to e1 as it zigzags from one side of the board to the other. And very likely Carlsen is assembling his forces, whatever remains of them, to try a last-second attack on black's king. That queen might be heading for g3. It might be trying to x-ray the g7 pawn, but Hikaru continues to push his campaign and continues to bring pieces off the board. Rook to e8, and now Carlsen has no choice but to acquiesce to the trade of rooks, but he plays queen to h4, and if Hikaru would have grabbed e5, Carlsen would have recaptured with the pawn and sent black's knight away and picked up the h5 pawn. So instead, Hikaru keeps the tension with rook e6, but queen to g5 is another really nice move, and look at the way that Carlsen is tightening the screws and attacking all of black's weaknesses. Now, the g7 pawn is under fire. The trade of rooks is still not in black's favor because, once again, Carlsen can recapture with the pawn and send the knight away and win the h5 pawn. And now Hikaru dropping on the clock and showing signs of panic. How is Hikaru going to keep his weaknesses defended in g6? What a committal move by Hikaru as he creates massive kingside weaknesses. And now all of the dark squares around his king are ultra weak. Carlsen says, thank you very much, and he trades rooks. He's likely going to put his bishop on e5, and that might spell a lot of trouble for black because once his bishop lands on e5, he's actually going to have mate threats against black's king. The queen can infiltrate to h6. It can infiltrate to d8. Well, Hikaru has to take on e6 with the queen. He's not thinking about the current move he's likely thinking, what have I just done? Why have I allowed Magnus to infiltrate all of the dark squares around my king? It says it all. His facial reactions say it all. And Hikaru is not happy, but he's got to keep fighting. He's got to recapture on e6 with a queen. If he takes on e6 with a pawn, he simply drops the knight on f6. And I think Hikaru is seriously regretting his previous move. He is showing signs of disappointment after bishop to e5. His knight will simply not have a good square. There it is, bishop e5, the instant reaction by Carlsen. Now the knight is going to have to move away from f7. Technically, Hikaru can defend the knight with king g7, but then he's going to be pinning his knight forever. That doesn't seem to be a viable option. Instead, he has to allow the infiltration of white's queen to d8 or to h6. So maybe knight d7 is the lesser evil. No, knight d7 loses. That knight has to go all the way back to e8, but now the queen infiltrates to h6, and Carlsen has fully infiltrated. Queen h8 and queen h7. The king is getting harassed, and there goes the a7 pawn. Finally, it's time for Magnus Carlsen to collect his harvest. He is now a pawn to the good. And most importantly, most worryingly for black, it's not just the pawn on a7 which disappears. The attack continues. Black's position is riddled with holes, but Hikaru continues to fight. He brings that knight back to f6. Eventually, he will try to move back to d7 and get that irksome bishop off of e5. Hikaru moves his king to e8, all hands on deck for Hikaru Nakamura, but now the queen can continue to zigzag from the queen side to the king side. The c6 pawn is weak, the g6 pawn is weak. Can Hikaru keep everything contained as Magnus Carlsen very patiently, this is a typical Magnus move. The king moves up to h2 and gets away from the line of fire of black's queen. Now, if white's bishop ever moves away from e5, there will not be a check on e1. Hikaru Nakamura will have zero counterplay against white's queen, and Hikaru continues to shake his head. This game is spiraling out of control. He is now a pawn down. His position is full of weaknesses, and his clock time is dwindling down to 0. Hikaru has no moves here. He can move the knight back. Instead, he angrily pushes his pawn to h4, trying to create maybe the preconditions for some sort of counterplay against white's king, maybe getting that h5 square for his knight. And Carlsen has to continue the pressure, right? He still hasn't won the game. Maybe he can push c4 and try to create a passer on the queen side. Maybe he can push b4 and toss the ball back into black's court. I don't see a forced win here. He can throw in that check on b8. He can play queen b8 check, but instead bishop to d6. Continuing to infiltrate down the dark squares, Hikaru offers a trade of queens. The danger, if Carlsen accepts that trade, is that Hikaru will be able to build some sort of a fortress. His queenside pawns are on light squares, and Carlsen does indeed trade the queens, but look at his bishop as it deftly, adroitly maneuvers back to f4, threatening to infiltrate to g5. Now it moves back to d2, but how is Carlsen going to break? Hikaru's last line of defense, bishop to e1, and both sides blitzing their moves, and f4, amazing move, undermining black's pawn chain. Now Carlsen has a passed pawn on h3, that's an outside passer, and he brings his king back to g1 as it zigzags up to f2. If Carlsen can get to Hikaru's pawn on f4, then the game will be over. That will be 2 extra pawns. Hikaru with just a couple of seconds on his clock as he instantly moves his knight back up to e6, but he's not going to be able to keep everything protected. He's given up the pawn on f4, and he has extended his hand in resignation. What an incredible surgical positional effort by Magnus Carlsen as he manages to take down Hikaru Nakamura in an on-demand victory in the Armageddon game of their 2023 CCT Finals match. What a game it was. I hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you in a video